the grandest thing has been lifting up the gates and the opening of the doors to the women of America, giving liberty to 27 million women, thus opening them to a new and larger life and a higher ideal. The Rev Olympia Brown, Universalist minister, known as the first woman minister whose ordination was recognized by any denomination. That's whose legacy we are lifting today, as the final Sunday of our 3-part series on forebears who sacrificed and paved the way for us in this faith. At the beginning of the month, we celebrated Reverend Sophia Lyon-Foss, who dared to say that children are people who deserve to be taken seriously. Last week, we lifted up Reverend Louis McGee, who dared to say that Black lives matter in this faith. And today we honor Rev Olympia Brown, who knew firsthand how being a woman in the world required one to do things twice as well as a man backwards in high heels and get less than half the credit. I'm getting ahead of myself in this story, but I do also want to acknowledge that as a suffragist, Reverend Brown spent her lifetime working to help women get the vote and was among the few original suffragists still alive to vote at long last in 1919. One other note before delving right in. If you are new to Unitarian Universalism, maybe you have heard that we are a creedless faith where we do not all necessarily agree on theology, on the nature or the name of God, or even the existence of a God. That's all true. We are bound together by covenant, not creed, and by principles of how we strive to live in harmony with each other and the world. It is also true that our roots are in 2 branches of Christianity, Unitarianism and Universalism, which merged and began to forge a new and wider path together in the 1960s. This month we talked about Reverend Sophia Lyon-Foss, who was a Christian Unitarian, and the Reverend Louis McGee, who was a little bit more modern and was a humanist Unitarian. And today we will reach back into history again to learn about the Reverend Olympia Brown, who was a Christian from the Universalist branch of our family tree. I mention this because later we will read a bit of her writing, and you will notice very sure God language that is not quite so common in our faith these days, since we have widened our circle and expanded what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. And so I just hope that that very tiny bit of history might clear up a question or two about that. So let me read briefly now from a history written about Reverend Brown for the UUA's Tapestry of Faith curriculum, author unclear. Olympia Brown was born into a Universalist family who valued education. Determined to seek higher education, she persuaded her father to allow her and a younger sister to go to college. First at Mary Lyons Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in Massachusetts, and then at the better suited Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Brown felt the call to Universalist ministry and sought admission to theological school, although this was not an option open to women. She finally persuaded the president of St. Lawrence University to admit her in 1861. In her autobiography, she writes, "Mr. Ebenezer Fisher, the president, replied that I would be admitted, but he did not think women could ever be called to the ministry." She continues, "President Fisher, in spite of his discomfiture at my entering the school, was just to me as a student and never discriminated to me and against me until I began to take steps toward ordination." When Brown completed her course of study in 1863, she had to convince the male ministers of the St. Lawrence Universalist Association to vote to ordain her so she could be called to parish ministry. This was a big deal. First one, as I mentioned earlier. The positive reception she received when she preached at local churches swayed the opinions of many of the ministers in her favor, and Brown was ordained. She says, "Mr. Fisher had so far overcome his feelings that he took part in my ordination exercises." After ordination, Brown served a church in Weymouth Landing, Massachusetts. With the blessing of the congregation, she spent months in Kansas speaking on behalf of women's suffrage, making her own living and speaking arrangements as she traveled. In 1870, she accepted a call to Bridgeport, Connecticut church. She married in 1873, keeping her own name, and gave birth to her first child the next year. In 1874, she decided to resign her ministry, although she continued to live in Bridgeport for 2 more years, giving birth to a second child. After careful consideration of her calling and her options after her resignation from Bridgeport, Brown wrote to Mr. A.C. Fish, the clerk of the Universalist Church in Racine, Wisconsin, to offer her services. He wrote back that the parish was in an unfortunate condition, thanks to, quote, a series of pastors, easygoing, unpractical, and spiritually unworthy, who had left the church adrift, in debt, hopeless, and doubtful whether any pastor could again rouse them. Brown accepted the challenge. And she and her family moved to Racine in 1878. She worked to rejuvenate the church and establish it as a center of learning and culture and a forum for the discussion of social issues of the time, including women's suffrage, of course. She invited Julia Ward Howe, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony to air their views from that pulpit. Under her ministry, the women began to vote and hold offices in the church for the first time. After 9 years of ministry in Racine, Brown left the thriving congregation, and moved on to a new challenge. She left full-time ministry to become an activist for women's rights. For the next 32 years, she labored, spoke, and demonstrated on behalf of this cause. And in the fall of 1920, she returned to the Racine Church and spoke about her life's work. She spoke the familiar words we find in our gray hymnal, singing the living tradition. It's reading number 569. I hadn't intended to read that together today. I didn't realize that all of our songs were out of the teal hymnal, and we didn't get the gray hymnals passed out to us as we came in. So I'll read you her words, but you can find them later if you choose in the back of our hymnal. There is nothing in all the world, she writes, so important as to be loyal to this faith which has placed before us the loftiest goals, the loftiest ideals, which has comforted us in sorrow, strengthened us for noble duty, and made the world beautiful. Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that we are worthy to be entrusted with this great message, that you are strong enough to work for a true great principle without counting the cost. Go on finding ever new applications of these truths and new enjoyments in their contemplation, always trusting in the one God which ever lives and loves. End of quote. I love this part. Do not demand immediate results, but rejoice that we are worthy to be entrusted with this great message, that you are strong enough to work for a great true principle without counting the cost. What a message. Without counting the cost. That's a lofty goal, isn't it? I think so. I might mention that nowhere in the historical records available concerning the life and ministry of Rev Olympia Brown is it noted that any church that she served paid her. She hustled, she did side work, got outside speaking gigs, and was no doubt sometimes sustained by the living of her husband. And still she persisted. I might also mention that despite her giving her all to the ministry in a faith that did not see her as worthy of the same regard as men, she raised the money needed to revitalize dying congregations with no thought of how she herself would live. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, for example, she was known to preach about the need for pledges and donations for the congregation and call out wealthy parishioners by name. P.T. Barnum was an avid fan of her ministry, and a congregant in Bridgeport followed her elsewhere, as a matter of fact. It is said that she would often talk about people who could dig deeper into their very heavy pockets and would say, "Yes, Mr. Barnum, I am talking to you." I just love that aside. Looking back on her career as a parish minister, Olympia Brown wrote this: "Those who may read this will think it strange that I could only find a field in run-down or comatose churches. But they must remember that the pulpits of all the prosperous churches were already occupied by men and were looked forward to as the goal by all of the young men coming into ministry with whom I, at first the only woman preacher, had to compete. All I could do was take some place that had been abandoned by others and make something of it. And this I was only too glad to do." Before I was privileged to come here and serve you all, I served for several years during my ministerial formation on a guest preaching circuit in the northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin area, and many times was honored to stand in the very pulpit that Reverend Brown used. Reverend Brown and Julia Ward Howe and Elizabeth K. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, to name a few, when I preached at the Olympia Brown Unitarian Universalist congregation in Racine, Wisconsin, which I am happy to report to you is neither run down, comatose, dying, nor dead. And they paid me the going UUA guest ministry rate for showing up every time despite my womanness. What an amazing road Reverend Brown paved for us all. I and every minister in this faith who does not identify as a cisgender male are the beneficiaries of the sacrifices of Reverend Olympia Brown, among many others. What an honor. What a responsibility. For whom am I paving the way? When we as a congregation and as a faith movement on a larger scale welcome people to serve in our congregations in whatever capacity they are called, for whom are we paving a new way? I don't know if the Universalists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries understood what they were even doing by allowing Reverend Brown to serve, but they were paving the way. Imperfect and problematic as their concessions to allowing her in were, they made history. I don't think we ever really know that we are making history as it happens, do we? I wonder if we think all the doors are wide open already because of people like Reverend Olympia Brown, instead of actively holding doors open and seeing who else we can let in, even now. My home church pastor, the UU church that raised me into being UU, the Reverend Matthew Johnson, is my home church pastor. He's a well-educated, cisgender, straight-passing man who acknowledges having all the privilege that such status encompasses in our society. He wrote this in his recommendation letter for me to the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee, with a slight paraphrase for brevity. Matthew writes, "When I came before the MFC, you all asked me what I was going to do with all of my privilege. I said I was going to hold the door open for people with less privilege. This is me right now holding the door open for Misha. Let her in." Beloveds, for whom are we holding the door open? We've been handed a legacy of lifting up the gates and opening the doors and smashing the stained glass ceilings, and it cannot stop with us. Too many worthy people still aren't sure where they belong, where their gifts can thrive, and which places only seem run down, comatose, dying, or dead to the casual observer because they have not been discovered yet by someone who loves them and delights in them despite the great cost. We've just got to make sure the doors are getting held open, that's all. The parallels are there for easy picking, aren't they? Lifting the gates, holding open the doors, instead of building walls and putting locks on cages. You all live this work, I know that. You support organizations that are doing the work of getting us all closer to free, no matter our class, our race, our gender, our sexuality, or our immigration status. You're already doing that work. How can we do it with even more intention? May we focus on keeping the gates lifted and the doors open always. Leave the light on for you. May we look into each other's eyes in amazement at the idea that the person beside you could very well be the one to revive a dream that for all the world looks at least 3 days dead. All I could do was take some place that had been abandoned by others and make something of it. And this I was only too glad to do, Rev Olympia Brown said. And so my wish is that may we look around us and pick up an abandoned dream, a half-dead relationship, or even a very life in peril this week. Make something of it and be only too glad to have had the privilege. May it be so. Come help me with this thing, Ross.
Right there.